This podcast is hosted by the Institute for Addressing Strangulation. This is part one of a two-part episode looking at strangulation and domestic abuse.
I'm here with Dr Patrick Brady, who's in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. Patrick, thank you so much for joining. Would you like to just give a brief overview of your research, particularly around strangulation, if you can?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So my research primarily focuses on how do we prevent intimate partner homicide, specifically focusing on strangulation and stalking cases. And so over the past really 10 years, I've been looking at this crime of strangulation in the United States and trying to figure out how do we improve criminal justice responses. Well, not just criminal justice, but also medical responses as well. And so not only, improving responses and increasing victim safety, but also helping, to unpack, answers to the questions that officers and prosecutors have, and, trying to answer those in ways that we can build stronger cases so that prosecutors can actually hold dangerous perpetrators accountable, even in cases where either the victim dies or is just too reluctant or terrified to participate in the criminal justice process.
Yeah, and I think that would be a really good place to start, actually, because we've recently published some data on police responses and cases in the UK, and looking at this in the second year of strangulation legislation in the UK. And it's quite consistently over 2 years now, between 40 and 50% of cases, no further action based on evidential difficulties because the victim does not want to proceed. So it's the majority of cases, or it's the most common reason why cases don't progress for us here in the UK. So is that what you see as well? And do you see the reasons for that? And what are the solutions for that, I suppose?
Yeah. And, and that's really hard. And, I always grapple with this victim-centered approach because ultimately, we want to provide as much information as possible to victims and allow, victims and survivors to make the decisions to participate. And survivors have a ton of legitimate reasons as to why they don't want to participate, whether that is, dependency issues, also the gauntlet of our American criminal justice system. And despite the fact that, there are people that are doing work every day that are trying to make the system a lot smoother and safer and, less emotionally distressing for victims, we have a gauntlet of a system that could be very intimidating. And then we also have, the Sixth Amendment, which, that defendant has a right to confront anybody who's, has accusations against them. And so, these are situations where, a lot of victims feel like they're going to die when they are being strangled. And so it's very scary to have to go in front of a room full of strangers and to recount what happened in front of, the person that, has professed their love to you or is related by blood and things like that. And so it can be very scary for victims to go through the system. And sometimes, even though strangulation is a repeat crime where generally survivors of strangulation have experienced strangulation multiple times, reading through case files, a lot of times these cases, the strangulation just kind of comes out of nowhere kind of thing. So it can be very kind of shocking and terrifying for victims in terms of participating. But what's been really interesting is, I've read, tons of police reports and prosecutor case files, but I actually just spent this summer working on a research project where I was observing how officers were administering lethality assessments and also strangulation supplements. And I did this because I wanted to see how officers were responding to domestic violence calls and really get a better, kind of context into, what are kind of the aspects of these cases that may help researchers get a better understanding of why victims may or may not cooperate. And it was really, really eye-opening. And so I spent about a month and a half doing this, observing officers as they respond to domestic violence calls, particularly the strangulation calls. And it's very, very it's way more nuanced than what we can really see from the data and also what we are getting from police reports. And so, there are a ton of other situations and things going on that you can kind of just really observe that you wouldn't necessarily see in the data. So, for example, there are times, so we responded to one of the strangulation cases that involved a mother who was strangled by her adult son. And it was and it was a really kind of chaotic scene. You could literally see a handprint on the woman's throat, and the son confessed to everything, and was obviously distraught about everything. And this started as a result of just ongoing tension over the years between them. And the mom said something that it upset the son, and he just like saw black and went into strangled her to the point that she was rendered unconscious. And so as I'm sitting there and observing how officers are administering the strangulation supplement, this victim did not want anything to do really with the supplement or to answer any of these questions. And it wasn't because like she was like anti-police or things like that, but like at this point, just understanding like she had just experienced this very traumatic incident that it was very shocking. This happened right before, right where she was cooking dinner, and so she was very concerned about the other kids that were in the back that were running around, and so she didn't really want to answer a lot of the questions. She wanted to, go be with the kids and things like that. And then she also just saw like her son, get arrested. And even though she wasn't against the arrest, you could just see that it was just, there was so much going through her head. And it wasn't for like a lack of trying, because the officers were definitely trying to administer the supplement. And I thought in a lot of these cases, they handled it actually fairly well. It's just, are so many different factors that are really kind of participating and stuff. And so so they weren't able to administer the supplement in that particular case just because there was so much, going on and stuff. And so really the purpose of that project was to see like, well, what happens when victims don't want to complete the supplement? Is that an indicator of, cooperation moving forward? And so I've collected a bunch of their case file data. And now I'm going to trace case outcomes to see the extent to which victim cooperation influences decisions like bail, charging decisions, and convictions and sentencing for strangulation in these lethality cases. But very similar to you over in the US, like about 50% of victims, that's where the cases drop off. And so, what I also notice is that, a lot of times when the police show up, like we have to remember that sometimes it's the involved parties. They weren't the ones that called the police, so they're not super thrilled that the cops are there. And then other times when victims do call the police and the police show up and stuff like that, they really just want the officers to kind of calm the chaos. They don't want anything going on moving forward. They don't want the person to get arrested, things like that. In this particular state, it was a mandatory arrest state, so it didn't matter whether or not the victim wanted the person to be arrested. If there was probable cause for charges, then the officers didn't have any discretion in that. And so also talking to the officers about victim cooperation, that was really interesting as well, because officers understand like why they have mandatory arrest. They don't always love it, but they get it. But ultimately it turns into like a liability issue. And so it's just like they kind of get this what we call like a moral injury, where it's just like they may not feel like an arrest is appropriate or necessary, but they have to make that arrest. And that was interesting because they would bring up like, so it's like, okay, so we make an arrest in this situation, but then down the line, those charges get dropped because either the victim doesn't want to participate or there's not enough evidence or other things like that. But then that comes back, when we have to respond to the call again, where they either won't call the police because they know that we're just going to come and arrest someone, or they won't provide any information because nothing happened the last time and things. And so it really is a lot of the decisions in the system that kind of come back and make things a lot harder for the officers when officers are really trying to get this information, but sometimes it is bound by policy and things like that. And sometimes the policy can override their ability to kind of make connections and be victim centered in that they can engage with the victim on scene, get some information, but then they have to make the arrest, and that can kind of change everything. And so, if victims aren't super, excited about or aren't super on board about the arrest happening and things like that, and plus we know that survivors that we are working with the day of the incident, are oftentimes a lot different when we are doing the follow up, and so it's really trying to assess their needs and keeping them safe. But what I really kind of wanted to see more in these cases was the involvement of medical personnel and things like that. There were several situations in strangulation cases where the medical personnel, like I just kind of wanted them to help the victim understand a little bit more about why they were there and, the importance of checking them out. And so sometimes the officers would be like, we see some injuries on your neck. And so sometimes, there can be internal injuries. We don't always see visible injuries in these cases and stuff. But again, it's just a lot of times, especially in the strangulation cases, like they can be very chaotic. And so sometimes the victim is still in crisis or they're just completely in shock of what's going on. And so in terms of, understanding victim cooperation and how do we improve conditions so that victims feel safe moving forward, it just becomes a lot more complicated and there's a lot of moving parts. And so it was really cool to be able to kind of do the research on this from reviewing case files to actually seeing it in real life and how it goes down, and just realizing that a lot of times like these are just much more complicated. And so this project really helped us get a better understanding of like, well, how do we improve victim I don't like using the word cooperation. I think participation is a better term, because there are legitimate reasons as to why victims don't want to cooperate with the system. And so I'm trying to figure out in this particular project, what are the types of cases where victims are the most reluctant to participate, which my hypothesis would be the strangulation cases. I can kind of see a double-edged sword where it's such a serious form of violence that I could definitely see victims being much more willing to participate, because they recognize that this is a very serious assault. This is a dangerous individual. We need to hold them accountable. Those tend to be the reasons why victims participate in our justice system. It is very much an altruistic kind of motivation. They don't want to do it, but they'll be like, I'll fall on the sword so that this person can be held accountable and this person doesn't hurt anybody else, kind of thing. So I'll deal with the trauma of the system moving forward. But at the same time, it's also a very terrifying crime. And, we as a system cannot guarantee the safety of a victim to participate in it. And so in these cases, a lot of times, like this person already tried to kill them, once or multiple times. And a lot of times strangulation is used to silence victims and to instill this power and control, not only during the incident to silence them in terms of whatever argument was going on, but to silence them moving forward. And so it's like, letting them know that, they may not be trying to kill them in that moment, but it sends a message that they can and will kill them, whenever they want. And so if they're going to cooperate with the system, which is a system of strangers who are really focused on kind of their own needs in terms of probable cause to, proving a case beyond a reasonable doubt, like, yes, they care about victims and their safety, but we can't guarantee that safety. Again, in one sense, these cases are serious enough that victims may absolutely want to participate in the system, but it's also the type of case where it could terrify victims into completely being silenced and not want anything to do, not even the illusion of cooperating, because they don't want to set the person off again in that sense. And so it's getting a better understanding of how do we kind of identify the types of cases and really remove some of the barriers that influence victims' decisions to not want to move forward, and to understand that I feel like we just have to get kind of into the system and get a better understanding of how these cases are moving forward.
And I think you've made some really important points there about how this is specific to strangulation as well, and why it's unique to this type of offence. And I think your point about kind of that initial shock because of the physiological impact on somebody and their state of consciousness, ultimately it could be the case, could lead to, as you say, that initial willingness to engage or feeling as though they should, because it's objectively incredibly serious. They almost died in that moment, but that same severity, that same crime, that's those same dynamics that surround that strangulation are possibly the reason why later down the line they don't feel able to continue. And I think your language around participation rather than cooperation is so important, because it is sometimes seen, I think, as a victim just doesn't want to carry on with it, as if it's some kind of inconvenience for them, that they just don't feel like it. But it's that they can't for whatever reason, or that they didn't want to engage in the first place, like you were saying about kind of the mandatory reporting and maybe third party reports. So some of that is domestic abuse and interpersonal violence, I suppose, more broadly, but elements of strangulation, I think, play into those dynamics. The point also about injury and there not being injury in many of these cases. So what evidence do you have if you don't have a victim there who feels as though they can testify to their account? So it does feel like I say, that there are nuances that that strangulation bring and play on those dynamics more strongly, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and one of the, I had a really great, I feel really fortunate to be able to have this opportunity, I was going to school down in Texas, and around the time Texas had updated their domestic violence law to incorporate strangulation as into the offense as a felony. Prior to this, most of the states in the U.S. like really had aggravated assault charges to pursue strangulation cases, and that was really hard because aggravated assault generally requires serious bodily injury. But again, sometimes we don't always see visible injury, and then sometimes strangulation does cause serious bodily injury, but not, nothing that we can corroborate unless the victim gets medical help. And then oftentimes, sometimes survivors are not connecting their injuries to a strangulation. And so that goes back to something that I wanted the EMTs to really convey is like, well, if you don't want medical services now, like, just so you know, like, this is definitely something you want to tell your doctor moving forward, because, if you start to have issues with like a stroke or things like that, like, strangulation is something definitely doctors will want to take into consideration in terms of their diagnoses and things like that. And so in Texas, they changed their strangulation law to actually have that language on there, and also to emphasize the seriousness of this crime within domestic violence. And so they had so many cases that they actually hired 2 special prosecutors to just run grand juries and fill any strangulation cases for domestic violence. And so I was able to link up with one of those prosecutors that was running those, and she was using this strangulation supplement, which is designed to really help first responders collect as much evidence for the elements as possible. And so this is looking at like, how do we, because it's one of those things where it's like you can create laws and you can enact these laws, but just because we have laws doesn't mean that they are enacted in the way that we want them to, or if they're even enacted at all. And so, okay, so we change the strangulation law, and then we go out and we tell officers, okay, but now you just need to, find probable cause for disrupted air or blood flow. How do you do that? Most officers are not trained medical professionals and things like that. And a lot of the signs and symptoms of asphyxiation can overlap with other things like glossy red eyes. If there's alcohol, they're fighting, raspy voice, things like that. And so there are ways that it can be easily confused as, a victim not being cooperative. And I'm using quotes with that. Cooperative, when they are actually, suffering some severe internal injuries, or they're just in shock and panic and stuff like that. And so she was using the strangulation supplement that really addressed a lot of those signs and symptoms, but also the intent of the perpetrator, because in the United States, a lot of these statutes are like they have to, knowingly go into this assault, wanting to restrict air blood flow or something along those lines, depending on what the statute is. And so it had a series of open-ended questions that would help the prosecutor get a better understanding, because like a lot of this was trial and error, because she was running a lot of these grand juries, getting indictments, but then not convictions. And and so she really learned, kind of what jurors wanted, like what they're looking for in these cases, and adapted the strangulation supplement to have some more of these open-ended questions. And so I was really curious in this, because this was kind of my first venture into strangulation and domestic violence, because my whole question that I had was like, I didn't understand why these strangulation assaults weren't being tried as attempted homicide, because like that seems like what they were. What is the purpose of strangling someone? So I wanted to look at that in terms of like, why, how does strangulation cases happen? What is the intent of some of these perpetrators' acts? And then how did the survivors survive this type of crime? And so on the supplement, they had kind of these 4 open-ended questions, and one, we documented kind of like what led up to the strangulation. The second one was, did the offender say anything to you during the suffocation or strangulation? The third question is, what did you think was going to happen? And the fourth is, what made the offender stop? And now the most recent version of the supplement has a lot more open-ended questions, especially for the signs and symptoms. And so the supplement also has these signs and symptoms of disrupted air and disrupted blood flow, and so they can ask yes or no questions, but now a lot of them are open-ended, so that the prosecutors can actually, show the jury like what the victim was saying on scene, like when it actually happened versus a yes, no checkbox. But the open-ended responses were fascinating. So the prosecutor let us come in and review all of their, about 300 case files, about 150 that didn't have the supplement and 150 that did. And so in one of the studies that I published, we looked at the 150 or so cases that actually had the supplement. And we wanted to look at like patterns across these cases in terms of what victims were saying for those open-ended questions. And that was really interesting. So in terms of like how strangulation really happens in these cases, again, like I said earlier, like sometimes it was like completely out of nowhere. Like we had a case where we were trying to find the right word because like everything really kind of kept coming back to this like provocation, but I hate that word because it seems like it really puts that blame on victims. And so we used the word triggered because that seems like what a lot of these cases was that the victim was essentially being assertive, and that somehow threatened the power and control that the perpetrator either was trying to instill or to maintain, and that just like set them off.
I think that's a really important point because I think sometimes the whole provocation conversation makes it seem like, or it's talked about in terms of the perpetrator loses control, again in air quotes, but actually it's that their control is being lost of that person. So yes. I think that's again such important language about where the blame lies, but also kind of actually they do have control. They wouldn't do that to somebody else. They do that to somebody because that control situation is being compromised for them.
And I do think a lot of these relationships are about power and control, because again, it goes back to this, like, why would you use this specific type of assault, if there was unless there was some underlying purpose. And so again, a lot of these, and so the assertiveness, like sometimes it would be like the victim saying, like, no, you can't go get more alcohol, like you need to go to work, or like, no, like I'm not going to keep watching the kid, like you need to do this so I can go to work and things like that. And they're like, bitch, don't you ever tell me what to do, kind of thing. And so again, it like threatens this ability to gain and or maintain power and control, and a lot of it comes out of these insecurities around the relationship. And so another common theme was like conversations about infidelity and trust and cheating and stuff, for over like very minor things. Like one time a victim parked in a different parking spot, and the perpetrator strangled her because he thought that she was that was an indication of her like cheating or something like that. And she literally was like, there was no other parking spot, and so I had to park there, kind of thing. But it's just like they are constantly suspicious of them cheating or using that as like some mechanism of infidelity, and then using the strangulation as like a way to kind of justify their insecurities about this. And so the data wasn't great in terms of like what led up to it, because a lot of times the officers would just put argument. And so unless we like kind of elaborated like specifically what the argument was about, like that was pretty much kind of the main theme. But again, a lot of these didn't just come out of nowhere. They were during kind of arguments about finances, money, substances, mostly infidelity and trust. But the really interesting findings that I thought really came from what did the perpetrators say during the assault. And so this really gave, us a glimpse into kind of what was going on during the assault, and kind of really tapped into that intent aspect of it, and really like, are they trying to kill the person? And so one of our most common themes was threats to kill. And so about, I think 25% of our cases, the perpetrator said something along the lines of, I'm going to kill you, or like, you're going to be 6 feet under, something like that. And so, to my research team, like we looked at that and was saying like, okay, so it's not the majority of these cases where the perpetrator is making a threat to kill, but it is a substantial chunk of cases, like almost about 1 in 4, where, there is some type of threats to kill. And so we recommended that really strangulation cases probably should be investigated as attempted homicide until the evidence suggests like otherwise.
And didn't you also find, and research over here has found something similar? Was it half of victims thought they were going to die?
Yes.
Or something in that region. So, you don't have, like you said before, you don't have to say it. You don't have to even kind of go to the extent of restricting someone's airways, a hand around the throat, and somebody can have that feeling because of that situation, that context.
100%. And that's why I really like the supplement, because, not only does that help provide context, but it also helps really counter defenses. The other thing too is like if they try to if defense attorneys try to like minimize it, saying like, oh, he just, moved her out of the way. It's like, well, why did she say that she thought she was going to die? Kind of thing. So even if they didn't say it, but the other things is like when you look at what they did say, like everything was very derogatory. Like our most common theme was like some derogatory statement. So it was a lot of like, bitch, I'm gonna kill you, or you whore, don't talk back to me, things like that. And then the other thing that really kind of guided our understanding of why these should be investigated as attempted homicide was the reason why victims were able to survive. So the number one theme that we found was the reason why victims were able to survive was because they fought back. Being strangled is a very primal fear, and so victims are going to react in ways that they can to get the pressure off of them. And so this is really important when you, for first responders who are responding to cases where you may have injuries on both parties, they're saying like, oh, the other one's the aggressor and things like that. And so sometimes, defensive or offensive injuries can be confused, and sometimes, the victim who was strangled could get arrested because there's injuries on the other party. And so that was something we really wanted first responders to understand, is that like, not that you should expect injuries in these cases, but that it is not uncommon for a perpetrator to have injuries on them as a result of the victim trying to get away and or survive. And then what was really sad was the second most common theme was the reason why they stopped was because of bystander intervention. And a lot of times this was because the kids would try to pull the perpetrator off the mom. A lot of these cases were male perpetrators, female victims. And so the kids were interrupting, or a neighbor interrupted, or the police actually showed up. And so in that sense, to me, so in a quarter of these cases, the perpetrator was saying, I'm going to kill you. In 50% of the cases, the victim thought, I'm going to die. And then the reason why the victim survived is because they either like fought back, or there was some extraneous factor such as a bystander that intervened. And so like, and only, and this is a more of a qualitative study. And so we kind of did a content analysis to kind of look at the prevalence of these themes. But in like 6% of those cases, the victim or the perpetrator stopped on their own. And so to me, that really shows that, like, again, this crime is really rooted in power and control, and whether the intent is to kill in that moment may not be in that moment. But I feel like people that are putting their hands or bodies or making it hard for someone else to breathe have some of that intent to ensure that that person, either eventually dies, and if it's not this person, it's going to be the next person. And so, there's something. I'm glad that people are doing this work, because this is a very serious crime that I feel like a lot of times gets overlooked in the United States. It is being taken a lot more seriously, but it really is kind of a silent killer in terms of whether it's the victim that we are dealing with now, or if this perpetrator is going to continue this in the future. Because again, it's a very powerful tactic to silence victims. And so even if they break up or he kills her and goes on to someone else, like, they're going to continue to use these tactics to get what they want.
Yeah. And I think some of the other reasons that you identified in that content analysis were really interesting as well, because another one was that the perpetrator kind of got what they wanted even. So yeah. That's why they stopped. So again, it comes back to power and control. They kind of, the control and the power was back with them. I think another one was that they saw the impact of what was being done, so that they saw the kind of the injury, or the person was the victim was unconscious, and that's the reason why they stopped. So again, it comes back to it's not all about intending to kill that person in that moment, because you would have thought in those cases anyway, you see someone's unconscious and you think, okay, this is going in the right direction. But for those perpetrators, they stopped because at that point, again, they'd done enough for what kind of had satisfied what they wanted or needed in that moment, and they can come back and regain that control when that victim survivor regains consciousness. So even those reasons I think were so interesting. And like you said, just under 6% of cases, it only was where they stopped kind of without any of those factors, which is the absolute minority of cases.
Yes. And what's really cool that we're starting to see is other agencies are using this supplement, and some of the research is coming out from it. And there was a study that was up in Washington, and they presented some estimates from the supplement, and their estimates were almost exactly what we found down in Texas in terms of, especially in terms of the what did the victim think was going to happen. I think we were like a couple percentage points off, but the majority of them thought that they were going to die when they were being strangled. And so, you know, again, it's not necessarily like an evidence-based tool because it hasn't been, thoroughly vetted and evaluated, but I definitely feel like it provides first responders and medical personnel like more insight. Because that was the other thing too, is talking with officers, in the case where the son strangled the mother, they ended up not charging that as strangulation. They charged that as like the lowest level of assault. And I was talking to some of the officers, and they're saying like, well, she didn't necessarily say that her breathing was impeded, which that isn't necessarily an element of the statute. It was a lot complicated. I personally thought it probably should have been charged as the person being arrested and charged by the officer as, I'm not sure what the prosecutors charged in the case, but they went with a lower misdemeanor assault kind of thing, even though like there was clearly injuries, which you don't always see, and things like that. What I realized is that officers kind of have different interpretations of the statute, and some don't always get these formal trainings. And that's what's really kind of unfortunate with, it's not that, like, obviously first responders need a lot more training, but the thing that, like, I feel like the general public doesn't understand is that, like, that's all like officers are doing is training. They have so many training mandates for so many different things, whether these are yearly updates of policies and laws and stuff like that, to just, in-house training that they have to go on. And so, unless they are opting into going to, a domestic violence, conference, or, getting some type of, or opting into some specialized training, like they're really getting a lot of training on strangulation on the job from a field training officer or a sergeant who's basically telling them, hey, you need to complete this form, ask those questions and stuff like that. So a lot of the officers like would say like, I don't necessarily know why I'm asking some of these questions. I just know I like have to, kind of thing. And then others, like they did have a little bit more training, and so they were able to kind of shed that light to other officers. But that was very similar for the cases down in Texas. Like the Austin Police Department that investigate a lot of these cases, they actually mandated that officers, use that supplement. And so a lot of the prosecutor would go in and do strangulation trainings in the post academy and things like that. And so they would get a little bit more of that specialized training and stuff. And now it's the thing where it's just like, agencies are really hungry for, specialized training in strangulation and stalking. And there are agencies that are providing those trainings, but they are, book solid and things like that. And so it's just, that's why I feel like this research is important in getting this information into the hands of practitioners, because what I also realize is working with officers is that they want to do a good job, right? Like these cases can be very frustrating. Like they don't love domestic violence calls, but they do love helping others, and they are frustrated by the system. But a lot of the times, like they understand, their role, and they want to, keep people safe. And they want to prevent people from continuing to hurt others, kind of thing. And so it just becomes a lot more complicated. So as much as we want to train officers on this, like it's getting them the time and the energy and the credits to be able to, to participate in those trainings. And so unfortunately, like, this is a crime that is a very strong risk factor for homicide. And so I wish there was a lot more emphasis on it. And, and I'm starting to see a lot more emphasis on it in training academies. But again, you go through post, that takes like a year kind of thing. And then if you don't have any additional training, it's like, it's very much of that quintessential, if you don't use it, you're going to lose that information kind of thing. So
absolutely. I think that's why something like a supplement, or we would probably call it a pro forma, and we've at the Institute for Addressing Strangulation, we've published guidance for police on the management of strangulation cases, which includes something similar to that in terms of the kinds of questions you want to be asking and the kinds of information you want to be gathering. I don't think it can be understated how important that can be in terms of that initial evidence gathering. And I read a paper recently, which was published this year, about the impact of strangulation legislation with regard to future intimate partner homicide. And there was a clear reduction for both men and women through having the non-fatal strangulation legislation in place, because first of all, it meant that perpetrators of strangulation were incarcerated, meaning that, as you say, that homicide timeline has been interrupted. But also, it was interestingly, there was a high proportion of males who didn't follow that or didn't end up being murdered by their partners who they'd used strangulation on, which would have happened prior to the strangulation legislation. So that kind of homicide trajectory goes sort of both ways, because somebody in an abusive relationship where strangulation has been used sees kind of one of two ways out of that situation. And we're starting to understand a bit more about suicide and victims taking their own life, but there's a risk to that strangulation perpetrator as well. So this legislation really interrupts all of that, but only if it's kind of responded to well and police have the resources to do so.
Yeah, and that's such a good point too, because we always look at this as kind of like victims in their own and offenders on their own kind of thing. And the thing is that like, these are insecurity issues, probably unaddressed trauma that is driving a lot of these things. But like, it is also a crime that we're not just going to be able to arrest our way out of. Like, yes, these can be very dangerous perpetrators, but like, what are we doing in terms of services to address some of the underlying causes of this, right? Because, it could be anger management, it could be substance use and things like that. And in the US, we have pretty strict sentencing protocols for domestic violence. Like in some states, it can be up to, a batter intervention program like every week that the offender has to pay for and things like that. But even the research on batter intervention, it can be, religious based. It doesn't necessarily address co-occurring issues like substance abuse and mental health and things like that. And so it's one of those things where we start to, we need more resources that are working with, the perpetrators of this to really address some of the factors that are going on. And so it is one of those things where, we have to kind of address that question of like, what are we doing with people that are committing this crime to ensure that they don't continue to do this in the future? And is there any, therapeutic modalities out there that can actually reduce, someone's use of violence, especially strangulation and power and control within intimate relationships? To me, that seems like something that needs a lot more intensive individual treatment versus a group batter intervention situation. So it'd be interesting in that.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can go onto our website ifas.org.uk to access further reports, research and podcasts on strangulation.